All right, so I've gotten somewhat dressed for the first time in like 2 weeks, and thank you for the opportunity to do that because it actually feels pretty good. You might be feeling me on that one too. So just also fair warning, my kids are here still working from home with no childcare. So if you hear other noises or swear words, you all know what that's about already. So I don't feel like I have to apologize, but just to warn you. Okay, so we're rolling into our first and only, honestly, big topic. And so I talked previously in our semester about this point in the course where we start to look at applied ethics and special topics. And because basically I feel like our whole life right now is one big applied ethics dilemma, just with COVID-19 and all of the changes that it's brought into our lives. I actually feel like we're overly saturated with applied ethics and with moral dilemmas right now. So what I've done is we're just going to focus on the most important one. And this is something that is actually built into our course requirements for a large part of why we're even together for this ethics class. It is something that the university calls our responsibilities for diversity and inclusion. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is racial equity, and I'm going to explain these words to you very carefully. And before we even get going, I want to acknowledge a couple of things. One, this is a hard thing to talk about. This is hard for me to talk about. It's hard for me to choose my words around this. It's hard for me to be aware of all of the things that I want to stay aware of as I'm going to explain some things to you. So just know that, like this actually is something that is more nerve-wracking for me to present. And I know that, I'm not going to do it perfectly. So I want you to be aware of that, and also be aware, again, of the basic premise of why we're together, that we're here for some kind of exchange. So if you don't like what I'm saying, that is fine. That is a good thing. Okay, and what I want you to do with that is bring it to the work that we're going to do together. All right, I don't want you to shy away from that because you're like, I don't want to embarrass her or embarrass me, or, I don't want to say something and like call people the wrong name or whatever it is that might be a problem, because we have to start somewhere. Okay, so if we're going to have talks about racial equity and all the things that come in that bag, we're going to have to give ourselves the permission to have the conversation. And so I also mean that by way of saying, please check me. Check my language, check how what I'm saying is landing with you, because I guarantee you there are probably more of you who have had the kinds of experiences that I have not had, and who are going to listen to me talk about these things that impact you in a different way than they impact me. And I want to be aware of that. And, again, I want to own that. So let's see, I'm going to try to stick with my notes a little bit more than I might have been doing. Now, what I want to do first is explain to you a little bit about my lens. And so this is something that I am going to be a little more direct with telling you where I'm falling in all of these, arrays of possibilities of how to approach this topic. And, that's partly because there is unanimous consent in the field of ethics that racist ideas, attitudes, positions, and beliefs are logically false. So there's not a defense of racism that I'm going to examine, right? We're not going to look at the other side, so to speak, as we might with other topics. And I am going to be very clear about why we're doing that. So I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to be very clear from the beginning that while I'm showing up for the conversation, I'm not necessarily going to question the correctness of that statement, that racism or racist beliefs are logically flawed. So that's part of the lens that I'm sharing with you. And to be more specific, I want to clarify a couple of things, because now when we talk even about the word racism, it brings up a lot of images in our mind, or a lot of associations in our mind of what that is. And so we tend to think of it as individual acts of meanness, of saying dehumanizing words to each other, or of, insinuating that somebody is less smart than us, or, whatever it might be. We tend to think of that as what racism is, of being mean to each other in a way that is really inexcusable. And there is a section to that. So, I want to remind you of this picture that we started the semester with, of the racist protesters in Poolesville, Maryland, who were advocating against the racial integration of their school systems. So these are white people picketing to keep their school white. So this obviously is a part of racism, but what we're really dealing with today is not so much these individual one-on-one, like imagine the things they might have been shouting or the things that they might have said to a Black person at these times. We're not talking about that. I'm not accusing you of that, right? I'm not expecting that that's the kind of behavior that I'm going to see from you, because the kind of racism that we're dealing with today is really something that's much more subtle. It's much more insidious in that it is embedded into the way that our country is built together. And the systems that keep our country going were created at a time where racist ideas were widely accepted and believed. So, again, this was not something that radical for the time. These people protesting, I saw this picture and I was like, holy shit, I can't believe they were allowed to do that. But it was not radical at the time, right? It was actually probably majority opinion in that town. They certainly don't look like they're ashamed or they're hiding what they're thinking. So let's keep that in mind. Now, my lens here is that the kind of racism we're talking about, and hence what we want to address as we move towards racial equity, is that we live in a present time culture. So I'm talking about right now, a present time culture of institutionalized white supremacy, which is a byproduct of the colonial system that helped create our power structures, meaning our systems, that order all aspects of our daily realities. So I'm going to explain some of this, and I've just thrown out the bomb of white supremacy. And this is another thing that kind of is a trigger point. It pushes a lot of buttons for people because, again, you're kind of wondering, well, what am I accusing you of? And so, let's just like hold our horses, right? Let's walk into this fairly slowly. So one of the things that I want to ask you as we get going, right? So I showed you our words here, right? We're here to talk about diversity and inclusion. And so I want you to ask yourself, what popped into your mind when you heard these words? Who did you think I was going to be talking about? Right? We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion. What do you think I'm going to talk about? You probably think I'm going to talk about the Black people and the brown people and the Native people, right? And actually, I'm going to talk about the white people, because what white supremacy is that very subtle idea in our culture that white is the default, and that race is everything else, right? So if we're going to talk about race, we're clearly going to talk about people who are dark, who are Black, who are brown. And that's actually not the case, right? So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're really talking also about the idea of whiteness, and the idea that whiteness is sort of the starting point or the baseline, and everything else is in another category from it. And I'm going to explain to you more specifically what I mean by this. Part of what is going to happen, and I was sort of alluding to this earlier, is that the language that I'm going to use is going to be, possibly problematic for some of us, right? It's going to take a little bit of getting used to in some cases to be able to really define and work with these concepts like white supremacy. So you're going to hear me talk about things like privilege. And this is another thing that pushes a lot of buttons, because we may feel accused of having something that we feel like we have earned. Or something that we feel like might not apply to us. So anyways, we'll get into that. I also want to say a word about how I'm choosing to refer to races. So, I'm a white person. You may be a Black person. I'm just going to have to use those words, right? Sometimes I try to say person of color. Sometimes I try to say African American. But really the most easiest thing for me to do and the most direct thing for me to do is to just say Black people, brown people, white people. And so, I'm going to ask for your permission just to be okay with me doing that. Now, another thing that I want to explain is a very specific example of the kind of white supremacy I'm talking about, because I'm betting you don't think of me as a white supremacist, right? You're probably not picturing me as like, with the skinheads and the neo-Nazi propaganda and stuff like that. That might be what we hear when we hear the word white supremacist. But the kind of white supremacy that I want to talk to you about is, I'm going to share an example from my own life. So this actually happened to me last semester with one of my students. And so you've all been in class with me. You saw the way that I started the class, where I asked us to go around and say our names and to say something about us. I often change that question. And so in this particular case that I'm going to tell you about, the question I had chosen was to tell us where you're from. So where in the world do you come from, right? And I kind of clarified that, tell us where you live on campus. Are you off campus? Are you on campus? But also tell us, where's your home? Where are you from? And so I said that bit, and then I said, because we may have people from all over the world, and I gestured with my hand like this, and I gestured directly at a woman who was sitting in the second row. She was a brown woman, and she was wearing a hijab, which is the headscarf that Muslim women wear. And so I, in my very demonstrative way of talking, I said, and tell us where you're from, because we may have people around here, or we may have people with us who are from all over the world. And I gestured quite directly towards this woman, completely subconsciously. So I want you to be aware of that, right? And so we went around, I didn't even really think of it very much. Maybe like a little catch went off in my brain where I was like, oh, maybe that was a little bit over the top to do. But as we went around and people said their answers, it came to this woman's turn, and she shared that she is a Rhode Island native, just like myself. So I was born and raised in Rhode Island. I actually grew up down the street from URI, and she grew up her whole life in Providence, Rhode Island. She was born into this state. And so what had happened in my brain was I had seen who she was, right? She was a brown woman in a hijab. And my brain had said, she is in a different category from me. I'm from here. She must be from somewhere else in the world, right? And that was an absolutely false piece of information, right? She was not from somewhere else in the world from me. She was from right here, same place that I've grown up in. And so my brain, before I could even recognize the fact, jumped to this conclusion that she was other than me, right? She was from somewhere else and I was from here. So that's the kind of white supremacy that we're talking about. And I want you to know I did apologize to her privately afterwards for this, because it's something that you might have heard the term of microaggression. I've now been taught to call those simply racial aggressions. And it's because the fact that micro is meant to allude to the fact that it wasn't intentional and it was something that was a very small slip of the tongue, so to speak, but that the accumulated effects of being treated like you're from somewhere else or you are somehow different from me is what can become a trauma for people. So it was a microaggression. It definitely was. I have a little friend down here helping me with some markers. So that's the kind of white supremacy in our systems that I want to talk to you about during this part of our course. It's this very subtle idea that, there's these categories. So, us and then them. And so I want to come back to the logical flaw in all racist beliefs, because this is something that is not debated anymore in ethics. Philosophers 100% agree that racism is flawed, because what it does is it creates those categories, so us and them, and it puts people in them for no good reason. And so if we talk about, any measure of humanness, and, this can get dicey because we also then might want to start talking about other types of, life forms or whatever. But basically, I want you to just kind of take my word for it at this point, that philosophers have diced this out to the point where they cannot find any logical difference that separates me from you based on our racial and ethnic identity. So our skin tone, for instance, does not have any actual logical reason to put us in separate categories. And then again, remember what happens is we put those into a hierarchy. So we say, white is on the bottom, or white is on the top, black is on the bottom. Or that's what's been said historically. And that's just, again, stating information that is historically visible. And there's a lot of ways that we can see this happening in real time. And so some of what we're going to look at together in this course is examples of how this is playing out in daily lives for people in this country. So the logical flaw in racism, again, is that it puts people into categories that have no logical basis. There's no actual good reason to put people into those two categories. Now, the way that we're looking at this is racism is now not so much present in our individual interactions with each other, but it's present in our systems. So when I say our systems, I mean our educational system. I mean our judicial and criminal justice system. I mean our prison system. I mean our child welfare system. I mean our healthcare system. These are big categories of things that organize our life, that tell us, kind of how to go through the motions of being a human in present day America. And they are built on foundations or ideological standpoints that are racist in nature. So what they've done is create funnels for people that kind of push us into having certain outcomes. And so at a certain point, we had much more drastic outcomes, right? So right after slavery, there was a period where that we might call the Jim Crow period, where there was still, maybe slavery was off the books, but there were still laws that legalized segregation of races. So this is the kind of racism that we're most familiar with. So this is the Martin Luther King Jr. and the Rosa Parks kind of racism. And so what's happened now is that racism has been, we've mostly taken away these kind of very outward manifestations of it, and it's become something that we now see in the outcomes of our systems. So why is it that there are so many more Black people incarcerated in this country than there are white people? And the answer is not because those individuals are committing more crime. This is something that we'll look at coming down the road. So, again, if things are coming up that you're disagreeing with, have faith that we will talk about them. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is how our systems are spitting out outcomes that show how racist our country truly still is. And this is something that if we're going to be reasonable, ethical people, it is going to be our duty to address and to think about. This is why it's so important for the university for us to talk about this in an ethics class. Now, I have a baby who's going to be messing with my camera here. I'm going to come back in a minute. I'm going to end this video now, but I'm going to come back with you on Thursday to talk a lot more about privilege and about a very specific example of looking at some of this play out. And so I'll give you another video that's going to kind of set the tone for that. But for today, what I want you to do is put some of these thoughts you might have churning or these reactions you have churning, I want you to put them to paper in the style of our journaling. So what you're going to do is basically write a journal entry, but that you're going to share with me only. So you're going to upload it to Dropbox. And so this is our Tuesday assignment. I'm not closing the box on any of these things, so you can submit it whenever, but basically it's due for Tuesday, if that helps give you some motivation. And here's the question. How has race impacted or not impacted your life? This is what I want you to journal on. And this can be very open. Feel free to say things that you might regret if you had to say them out loud. This is why I'm having you submit it to me privately. I want you to know that I've made many of mistakes in when I start to talk about this. So I want you to feel free to say whatever it is that is your honest reaction to things that I've said here. And to also deeply reflect on how has race impacted or not impacted your life. So see what comes up, share it with me, and I'll be back on Thursday. See you then.